Alrighty, welcome back to Module 2. We are going to be going over lessons 3, 4, and 5 in this module, and those will make up our elements of design, which those are our really like our primary and most basic ways of talking about artwork. I call them the ingredients of artwork. And then our next module, in Module 3, we'll get to the recipes, or what are the principles of design. But the ingredients are really just what makes up artwork. I will just kind of like preface this slide with this module with letting you know that there are a lot of vocabulary terms that I will ask you to reference back on in later assignments and in later modules. So, just make sure that you're taking notes and that you are aware that there is a lot of vocab here, a lot of terminology that will need to stick with you for the rest of the course. So let's go through quickly before we go through each one a little bit more individually and explain what those mean, what our elements of design are. So our elements of design are line, shape, space, form, and mass, or form or mass, value, texture, and color. So we'll go through each of those and kind of describe what those are, different qualities that those things have, and how you can talk about them within artwork. And then also, sorry, honorable mention on this that we'll talk about a little bit is time and motion as well. So let's talk about line first. This is our most basic element of art, but it is also probably the most intricate because it does make up most of what we understand about artwork. The definition for a line is simply the connection of at least 2 points in space. And then I've got a little Paul Klee, who's a famous artist, if you don't know him, quote, and it says, "A line is a dot that went for a walk." Alrighty, so we're going to get into, and is kind of just like boring, mundane as this goes through, but we're just going to talk about the different types of line, and that's kind of how we'll divide this section. So our first kind of line that we'll talk about is a gesture line. A gesture line is produced by the movement of the artist's hand, arm, or body. So, gesture line can mean a lot of things, but when I think about gesture line, I kind of think about like the most intense and like kind of crazy versions of this. And my first artist that comes to mind is going to be Jackson Pollock. And if you don't know who Jackson Pollock is, you've probably seen his paintings before somewhere online or in pop culture or something. But they're like the splatter paintings. You can see one that's kind of in progress back here, and then one that he's like actively working on the floor here. Action painting is involving motion. It is essentially tracking the artist's movements with the marks that they're making or the lines that they're making on the page. So it's not about trying to get a lot of detail oriented, like smooth the lines out, trying to make it seem very the act of like the actual, or like the look of an actual line disguised. You're wanting to look at the mark making and it be a reflection of what the artist was doing to create the mark itself. So we see here Jackson Pollock is quite literally just kind of slinging his arm around. Action painting is what we'll call it there, and creating different marks on the canvas on the floor. So we know this involves a lot of movement, a lot of motion, which is all what about gesture line is. So the motion then allows a line or a mark to be made from a media, i.e. Charcoal, paint, etc., onto a substrate such as paper, canvas, etc. Our next type of line we're gonna talk about is contour line, and this is a little bit kind of like connected with gesture as well. But contour is the outline of a form. So think about like a coloring book, how there are lines that sort of define the different subjects and different content that are there, but they're usually not filled in. A type of contour exercise that you can do, it's a blind contour drawing, and this is a active practice of artist Egon Schiele, who is a very well-known contour line painter and drawer. But essentially, what you do with a blind contour drawing is that you will either close your eyes or you will look at something that is like your hand, for example, over here. So watch my like little box of how I'm doing this to make a connection here. But you've got say your hand here, and you're looking at your hand while your pencil and your other hand are drawing, but you never look down at the drawing while you're creating the blind contour drawing. You're always looking at your hand and just trusting that, you know, your other hand will follow your brain in connecting some of these lines. Usually blind contour drawings are not super accurate. Obviously this one here, this isn't how, you know, or hopefully your hand doesn't actually look like this. But it almost captures more of like the essence of something rather than like the, you know, creating it like a perfect version of the hand. So I think about with blind contour drawing too, how you might, you know, if you, we'll use the hand as an example again. You can probably close your eyes right now and imagine a hand in your mind. Like you can just, there's a picture of it that pops up. But then if I ask you to draw that, hopefully it would look a lot different than what your actual hand would look like. You know, your idea of a hand is going to differ a lot from like the actuality of it. Hopefully that makes sense, but this is just a good exercise. And also if you're interested in like some of these other ideas that sort of coincide with blind contour drawings, I would highly recommend reading or looking into Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain by Betty Edwards. It's a really great book if you're interested in, just think back on our last chapter, if you're interested in kind of turning on that side of your brain that is more actively seeing and taking in information and associating it with different memories and your own experience rather than it being sort of tight and more like logistical as your left brain is. But blind contour drawing sort of stems from some of her ideas. Really interesting stuff. Sorry, I went on a little tangent there with that, but essentially contour line is just like the outline of a form. Implied line. So this is sometimes not an actual, it doesn't have to be like an actual like drawing or painting. An implied line can exist really anywhere. It doesn't have to be something that is like particularly geared toward art. So implied lines are suggested by intentional alignments of shapes. So we see these a lot in our everyday life. Think about like when you're driving to work or driving to school and you see like a row of traffic cones. And we, even though they're not touching and creating like an actual line that like, you know, connects the dots literally in between them, we know that that line exists there. And our brain, you know, tells us like, okay, there is a line that is directing me away from an area or like around an area, and I don't need to go through that line. Our brain connects the dots for us and tells us, you know, this is a line, this is a, you know, barrier of sorts. Other examples of this could be like I've shown here, like the flock of birds that sort of align themselves, and you can connect the dots like to create these or to allude to the fact that these birds are in a line rather than just like in a messy, you know, unorganic shape. I would say in this scenario, like with like the birds, for example, you need two or more points in space, just like with the introduction there. You need two or more points in space for it to be an actual line that you connect. My next kind of line that we're going to talk about, it's a little bit confusing and it does sort of like coincide a little bit with the implied lines, but it's a little bit different. It takes a little bit more of that, like, you know, active seeing to be able to understand what psychic lines are. Psychic lines are similar to implied lines as they are not actually present, but can generate or can be generated by such things as characters gazing in a work. So this is a sculpture done at Burning Man, a festival in the desert in Nevada, I think. But essentially, this sculpture is telling us a lot through psychic line that it sort of narrates the story that's happening. With both examples here, this is just it at night and this in the daytime. But we see that there are two figures, the bodies that are made out of the wire there that are not connecting. They are, you know, they're lines of direction. Like, you know, think about your gaze as being a line. So whatever direction you're looking at, that's a psychic line that is being created between you and, I'm just looking around my office right now, but me and the door, me and my bookshelf, me and my other computer here, you know, wherever I look at, there's this psychic line that's connecting, you know, my view to whatever it is that I'm looking at. So in this analogy here, these two characters are sort of looking away from one another. And then the two characters that are within them are looking towards each other, and they're creating this psychic line between one another. And that can be really important to talk about symbolism in a work, talk about different connections, different content, without actually having to use like a verbal language to explain it. So here are some different line variations. The first one is also obviously just an actual line as you would, perceive it normally. B is an implied line. We've got C, these are actual straight lines, and implied curved lines. So we're using like a stack of lines almost to create this same line that we see in A and B. A line created by an edge, vertical lines and horizontal lines, diagonal lines. And I'll go into that just a little bit while we're on this slide, actually. But the direction of lines can really tell us a lot about different content and meaning to a work as well. Our brain automatically associates symbolism, whether you know it or not, with the direction that lines go. So think about like your vertical lines. Think about things in life in our natural world that are vertical lines. So think about things like buildings and that vertically extend up like skyscrapers. Think about trees, probably the best example there. Those things are always going to be like our stable, very grounded objects, or things, events, whatever it might be, buildings, trees, whatever it might be. And so vertical lines, artists can play on that and use vertical lines in their work to create a sense of stability and strongness and power. And so, think about that the next time you look at an artwork. Think about how vertical line is being used, if it is used, or the absence of vertical line, and what that kind of tells us about the work. We also see horizontal line. Think about what happens horizontally. You are usually in your bed asleep. And that means that you are at rest. So think about horizontal line as attributing to this attitude of rest and at peace, not up, not active, and how that can play into artwork as well. And then lastly, diagonal lines. These lines show us that there is action. Sometimes it can be slow action or fast action, just depending on the severity of the angle of the lines. But diagonal lines give us like the opposite of a vertical line. It gives us this feeling of instability, action, movement, not staying still. And we'll talk about kind of how that can play into other elements later on as well. We've got sharp, jagged line. We have dancing, curving lines. And we have hard line and soft line. And then a ragged or irregular line. And we'll talk a little bit more about how sharp and jagged lines can make us feel, opposed to more like curving lines that give us a more sort of sensual dancing feeling. And it's the next slide. I was thinking it was a couple more past this, but let's talk about the characteristics of line as applied to actual artworks themselves. So if I was in an in-person class, I would give you guys the opportunity to give me feedback on this, but I'm going to kind of answer these questions for you, and you can kind of be thinking along with me here. I might pause for a second and ask you what you think about these drawings. So what words would you use to describe the lines in the left image? Just looking at it, kind of what associations do you draw to it? What kind of feelings does it evoke for you? Turn on that seeing brain for a minute and try to focus on what might come to you. For me, I would think that I wouldn't think, but this drawing on the left here, and we're talking about this one, the kind of dancing girl, it feels very peaceful. It feels very fluid. It feels like there's no tension really. It just feels very natural. The curvature feels like very flowing and sort of, just a very nice, easy feeling. It doesn't feel like there's any tension happening. And then on the right, kind of think about how that one differs from the one on the left. What kind of feelings or memories or thoughts come to mind? For me, I think the one on the right, there's really, I think what is interesting about these two pieces is that they're in the same medium, using the same colors. They're very similar subject matter, similar compositions, and really the only thing that changes between them is the quality of the line, or the characteristics of the line. So while the one on the left is all using like curvy lines, there's no sharp angles or jagged areas there. The one on the right totally contradicts that, and it's all jagged, angular lines that are being used. And so this one makes me feel like there is a lot of tension and aggression and sort of like anger within it. And that's really entirely evoked through the quality and the characteristics of line here. So I think these are two really good examples of how those just, basic elements of art being, or this basic element of art being line, can totally change the mood and the feeling of the piece. And I think that, generally that's the response that these two pieces are going to evoke, is that the one on the left is very calming, very fluid, very flowy, while the one on the right is very aggressive and jagged and has a lot of tension to it. So, but you could maybe interpret those differently. And I think that's something that's, just an example of how art can be really interesting, is that we all bring our own memories and associations to artwork, and it can make us feel, it's not going to make everyone feel the exact same way. Okay, so moving on to our second element of art, which is shape. This is made when a line is enclosed, and it is two-dimensional. So this is not our like mass and form quite yet. A little box here. There we go. That's good. So let's talk about the two main types of our two-dimensional shape that we have. We have organic shapes and geometric shapes. Sorry, I have something in my throat. On the left here, we've got the organic shapes being often curving or rounded. They seem more relaxed and informal than the geometric shapes, and most shapes in nature are organic. So think about trees, think about flowers, think about yourself, your body. It's not going to be geometric and like, very angular and rigid. We see geometric shapes being more precise and regular. These are going to be circles, triangles, and squares. And circles is kind of a weird one, because like a perfect circle is geometric. If it's perfectly equal on all sides, it can be divided into all types of like different angles and everything, and it comes up equal every time. But a circle can also be sort of more associated with or an organic shape as well. But for this context, we're going to put circle into the geometric category. These are often made with the help of tools such as rulers or compasses. It's really hard to just naturally draw a perfect square or a perfect circle. And most common shapes in the human-made world are geometric. So think about like our desks and our computers and our phones and, our food products, like our, cereal boxes, things like that. A lot of things in the human-made world lean into more geometric shapes. All right. So now talking about mass and form. And the main thing that differentiates mass and form from shape is that form has this third element, which is depth to it. So height and width, or like length and width, would also work for this. But depth is that thing that that gives it the three-dimensional feeling to it. Height / length and width are not going to be that. That's just going to be our two-dimensional space. Gotta move myself again. All right. So mass in 3 dimensions, this is very easy to understand. Most all sculptural work is going to be 3-dimensional and have mass to it. Mass is a major element in sculpture and architecture, obviously. This is one of Yayoi Kusama's pumpkins, and she is a very famous sculpture and 2-dimensional, like, painting and printmaking artist as well. And this is also an example of closed form. So this is a solid form. There is no entryways into this or out of this. There's no parts where there is like negative space being created. On the other hand, we have an open form, which, sorry, I maybe said that incorrectly, but the Yayoi Kusama piece is a closed form. And the this piece here that is done by Umberto Baccioni, is an example of an open form. So this sculpture here is made to sit on like some sort of surface that sort of, you know, closes the dimension, or like the angle from, you know, where the sculpture starts to where the table is. But then it allows for this open space to exist right here, hinting towards the term open form. If there is negative space that makes itself present or known in a sculpture. So think about this area here as being an open space or an open form. So mass and form also exist in 2 dimensions as well as 3 dimensions. It's just a little bit less natural, and you have to sort of work to achieve this idea of mass or form that you don't have to do so much, obviously, in 3-dimensional sculpture work, where the medium itself is naturally or just is going to always be 3-dimensional or have mass or form to it. This is an example of that, where the form and the mass are implied rather than actually just physically there and you can reach out and touch it. So it's implied by using shading, using like these different shades here of value, different color, to imply that there's like a roundness or there's an actual form that causes, or that implies some depth to it, rather than it just being a flat, you know, contour line. So I think that's a good way to kind of connect these two, is that, you know, a contour drawing that is like a coloring book obviously doesn't have any implied mass or form to it, because it's just the outline. It's strictly 2-dimensional. It only has the height and the width to it. Whereas with this piece, when we start shading and adding the values in there, we start to see this implied depth or this sense of form there. Okay. I am going to pause because it takes a little bit to upload these really long videos sometimes. And we'll come back for part 2 and begin on space in part 2 of module 3, or sorry, module 2. We'll continue on with space. So jump back into, there's no videos you need to watch in between this or anything, but just stop here, pause the video, maybe go get yourself a snack or something, or, you know, take a break if you need to, and then jump back in for part 2 of module 2.